Well, thank you for all of those of you who are coming in. We're Richard and I are joined by the irrepressible and wonderful Anne Widdecombe, who, as you all know, is a Conservative former cabinet minister. And I hope you all enjoyed the bits at the end there when Anne made me stammer more than, I mean, I've always had a bit of a stammer, but she really brought it out when she asked why are men so feeble. So it would be lovely to get some questions and some chat around that. Richard, I wonder if we could start on a topic you were just talking about, perhaps in relation to Scotland, about hate crime.
Yes, yeah, I'm just mentioning the strange turn of events in terms of hate crime legislation in Scotland. The Scottish government's passed a hate crime bill that covers all the usual protected characteristics. So it would have been in it, you could have a sex-based hate crime that a man could commit against a woman or a woman could commit against a man, but it would be there alongside all the other protected characteristics. But the feminists objected to this, and they said, no, we don't want that. We don't want a crime that women can commit against men. We want a crime that only men can commit against women. So the so-called Justice Secretary inevitably said, okay, yeah, that's fine. That's what we'll do then. And so a committee is now looking into this, and all the feminists are gathering together to decide what law they'd want. I mean, there should be a massive controversy. There should be uproar about it, but it's just passing without comment in the media and in the political establishment.
I wonder if you have a view, Anne, about, I mean, it's a common view across the men's rights movement that some women believe misogyny is very commonplace, almost endemic, and we in the men's rights movement know it's virtually non-existent. Whereas misandry, the hatred of men, is very, very common.
I was just going to pick up on something Richard said there, the whole question of the one-way flow, you know, it only goes in one direction. Even if the law itself stipulates otherwise, you can still get that effect in terms of its practice. We've had this with race law for a very, very long time. You know, if you say something derogatory about somebody because he's black, that will quite likely bring you into trouble with the law, but the reverse doesn't work. If somebody insults a white man purely on the grounds that he's white, that doesn't count as a hate crime. And so the question of the one-way flow, I mean, Richard, you know, it's been sorted out before the law on this occasion, but usually what happens is the law looks balanced and the practice is completely the other way. It's unbalanced. But coming back to your main question, which is, you know, women see misogyny everywhere. Yes, I think they do. You know, we even tell that wolf whistling is a hate crime. I mean, you know, I hate to enlighten my fellow women, but actually wolf whistling is usually a mark of appreciation, and most women will just, you know, just accept it and pass on by. If they're the flirty types, they'll turn around and smile, and if they're the snooty types, they'll just walk on. But you haven't come to any harm from it. And what worries me is I was a 70s feminist. And in the 70s, what we said is we just want a level playing field with the men, which we didn't then have. We want a level playing field with the men. And having got that, we'll show you we're as good as, if not better than the men. And then in the 90s, all that changed. And it became, we wanted special privileges. We wanted all women shortlist. We wanted this favour and that favour. And the same thing goes for things like misogyny. You know, women are now complaining, whereas in the 70s we said, we'll work, you know, we can work just as well as you. The fact that we have something every month and that we have a menopause doesn't mean we can't work. Now women are making a big thing about the menopause, a big thing about misogyny, a big thing about any minor thing. You cannot tell a woman that she's got a nice dress. This apparently is sexism. But I can tell a man that he's got a nice tie. You have, by the way, Richard.
Thank you.
Nice to know someone made an effort there, Richard. Thank you. And the first question is from Douglas, and it's in relation to, it was inspired by International Men's Day debate, which was held recently to commemorate International Men's Day. And as usual, well, first of all, it was in Westminster Hall rather than the Chamber, which is normally the case, whereas the Women's Day debate is always in the Chamber. But the attendance was appalling. I think the only Labour MP was a woman who was a shadow minister for women and equalities. There was a man who was an SNP, I can't remember his name offhand, was an SNP MP who started off his 12-minute talk by saying he didn't think there should be an International Men's Day debate until all women's issues were sorted out. Really, really unpleasant. There's a line apparently in Hamlet about parliaments being exemplifying the insolence of office, and he wonders if you agree with that assessment of your former workplace.
Well, my view is there shouldn't be a men's day and there shouldn't be a women's day. You know, we should be equal, and you know there is no need for either. But if there is a need for one, then there is a need for the other. And that is how you have equality. I honestly think that the problem in Parliament is less one of insolence, although it may be by a few individuals. I think it's much more ignorance. I think it's much more ignorance than insolence. People don't understand the very real issues that there are facing men. And that does surprise me to a degree, because certainly as an MP, I got lots of cases where men were being frustrated from getting access to their children. And therefore, if I was getting that, I imagine that other MPs were getting that. So I have got a glimpse of it. But I think still the mentality is that it's women who are the persecuted sex, not men. And my view, as I've said right from the start, is I'd rather neither was the persecuted sex. I'd rather we were genuinely equal, competing equally, living equally, equal before the law.
I would say it's a manifestation of a broader political philosophy, isn't it? That every society divides up into oppressors and oppressed along as many lines as possible, and then this just gets put into the same framework. And so for a man to feel they're on the good side, they feel that they need to be on the feminist side because men are the oppressors. And once you look at it from that, through that lens, then you can't possibly see men's issues and women's issues as being equally valid, because this is a struggle for power between the oppressor and the oppressed. And I think that's the viewpoint that dominates in Britain. And that's why it's so difficult to get a fair hearing for men's issues, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I think that's perfectly reasonable observation that women are regarded as the oppressed, but I do not understand why. We've got everything that we asked for in the 70s, and now somehow we've changed the terms completely, and now we want pity and we want special favours. I don't want any wretched male boss patronising me and giving me special favours and giving me time off for this, that and the other. I don't want any of that. I didn't want it in the 70s, and I don't want it now.
No, but you know, when you're a privileged class, victimhood is the road to yet more privilege. And we have a very interesting question from a guy called Steve Moxon. Now, Steve wrote a wonderful book called The Woman Racket back in 2008. A really, really important book. And he says this: Anne, would you accept you need to read up on domestic violence? As the author of 3 peer-reviewed science review papers on the topic, I can tell you that overwhelmingly women are the perpetrators, not least when it's serious. Men underreport compared to women by a factor of 10. Normal men are shown to hold back, whereas women in general choose violence as their main mode of aggression in a couple context.
Well, I still stand by my view, you know, okay, I would accept that you may have the statistics. The official statistic is, I think, that a third of the victims of domestic abuse are male. I've also seen 40%, but I think the official one is a third. And instinctively, we all know that the average man is much more powerful physically than the average woman. And on the whole, I would expect a man who is being attacked in any serious way, I'm not talking about shoving and pushing, but in any serious way, would be able simply to grab the woman's hands and hold her off.
But they don't.
Why not? Why not?
And they don't, because they are taught, they are socially conditioned from a very young age. You don't hit girls. You don't hit women.
Hit girls, but you can restrain a girl by holding her hand off.
No, the impact of that social conditioning. I mean, just to go back, I can't remember if we mentioned it in the interview, Anne, but the biggest ever review of the world research literature on domestic violence was a thing called the Partner Abuse State of Knowledge project in 2013, PASC 2013. And one of the astonishing findings that it found from reviewing, I think, thousands of studies, was that in heterosexual couples, if we take as a cohort heterosexual couples where there's violence, in about 60% of those couples, there's a mutuality. Sometimes one starts and sometimes the other. But in the 40% of cases where it's always one way, it's always either the woman or the man, it is slightly more than twice as likely to be the woman as the man. And the fact that people generally find that difficult to believe with is because of 50 years of relentless propaganda. I mean, we tried to put an advert in the Spectator magazine, show, and they point blank refused without saying, and all we were doing was showing research results. This is, you have to ask yourself, why is it that you cannot even pay to get the truth about domestic violence into the media?
Well, I'm not going to argue with your statistics. I find the mutuality one entirely plausible. But I just have to say, men are stronger than women, and I need a lot of convincing. And when it's very serious, it can be with a weapon, of course, and that's slightly different. But where it's just literally fisticuffs, I have a great difficulty in believing that a man can't hold the woman off. I would not expect. I mean, I stand 5 foot tall, only just these days, in my stockinged feet. And I would not expect to be able to assault a man with impunity. I really wouldn't. I mean, it's just, it's not credible.
And that's perhaps why people struggle with it. But the nuance here is it's not that men can't, Anne, it's that men don't, and they are conditioned from the youngest age, usually by their mothers, but by wider society. I mean, there've been a number of people who've done experiments in parks where one partner's being violent towards the other, and if it's the man being violent or aggressive, immediately a load of people come over. If it's the woman being aggressive towards the man, people laugh. And it's the number of cases where there's the archetypal 5 foot tall woman and a 6 foot tall male partner, and she's violent towards him, has been for 20 years, and he hasn't raised a finger once.
Well, I mean, I cannot understand how, if you're being hurt, I'm not talking about a few blows that don't come to very much. I'm talking about being hurt, actually being hurt by a woman. You can restrain that woman. You really can. And so, if you don't, well, you're crackers.
Well, that's not very sympathetic, Anne. We wouldn't use the crackers argument for women who didn't fight back.
No, because I wouldn't expect a woman necessarily to be able to fight back successfully. And if she did fight back, she might provoke even more violence simply because she is weaker. Right. So physically weaker. So I'm going to stick to that. I mean, I'm quite happy for you to deploy all the statistics you want to deploy. But common sense says that a man physically is always, unless it's a weapon or unless it's from behind, is always able to defend himself against a woman. Always. It has to be. Of course, he's stronger. He's bigger. He's stronger. He's got the innate strength. Well, nobody's suggesting he hits her, but he can stop her. He can stop her.
But Anne, if you don't use it, and men will not use violence against women.
Then, as I say, I think if somebody's being badly assaulted and doesn't use violence and doesn't restrain the person who is assaulting them, regardless of whether that's a woman or a child or whatever it is, and I'm only talking about restraint, I think that is crackers. I'm sorry, I'm going to say that. I speak my mind, and I would say, never hit back, but restrain. You're entitled to restrain. You're entitled to grab hold of her hands and say, stop it, stop it, stop it.
The man would still be a victim of domestic abuse. I'm not disagreeing with you necessarily, but the man would still be the victim of domestic abuse. If he's having to do that repeatedly.
Oh, I agree.
And he is in a position where he is being abused and needs to get out of that relationship and could be traumatized by it, but regardless of the balance of physical power, I would say.
Oh, I'm sure that is quite true. And you bring us back to base, which is the actual domestic abuse statistics. I'm sure that is quite true. I'm trying to explain to you why it seems intuitively implausible that it's going to be men who are largely the victims of domestic abuse. I would accept the third figure, 2/3, not 1/3. I think that is quite plausible, but I'm not going to be told that it's a majority. Not without an awful lot more proof.
Well, Anne, I sent you a copy, as you know, of The Empathy Gap by William Collins. There must be 50 pages on this in that book. So sorry. Yes, there are maybe 50 or 70 pages in William Collins's book, The Empathy Gap. I invite you to have a look at that. Can we come on to the question you asked? Why are men so feeble? Why won't men fight for their rights? The reality is men are thrown under the bus. I mean, very often by other men. So if you take Parliament, 400 male MPs roughly. The only MP who's ever spoken at any of our conferences has been Philip Davis, the wonderful MP for Shipley, who's spoken at 3 of our events. We had 3 Conservative MPs lined up for this conference. All of them bailed on us without reason. Men will not. It's these people who are throwing men under a bus.
Oh, I can tell you exactly why. Well, why I suspect those Conservative MPs pulled out. It was because, as you know, there's been quite a concerted effort to paint your organisation in less than flattering terms, and to suggest that you are in fact misogynistic and that, etc., etc. So I suspect that's why they pulled out. But there was one group, you will remember, I'm sure, Fathers for Justice. And very gradually, and it was terribly slow, but very gradually, their campaigns did begin to have an impact. Now I was sitting, in the members' dining room, in the members' tea room, in the bars, all the social places in Westminster where you talk, and this subject started to come up. Now, for years, I have been saying men have a very raw deal at getting access. And I may have been saying it for years, but it was going nowhere. But suddenly that group, right up until the moment when they chucked powder at the Prime Minister, which was the stupidest thing they could have done, but right up to that moment, that group was starting to make some headway. And I think that's how it's got to be done. It's got to be done by just repeating the message over and over again. It is how. It's no good just writing to your MP and that's it. Done. I've done my bit. It's a question of persistence. And what I always say to people is, right, go make an appointment to see your MP in his or her surgery. Go along with somebody else if you need the confidence, and face to face say, and keep it polite and keep it factual, and say, do you realise that? And I think that is very important, because these things are a result of the build-up. When it first starts, nobody takes any notice at all, but then there's a build-up. Fathers for Justice were just starting to get there, and I think you could again.
I wonder if we would come on to the topic of abortion, Anne. You're a well-known pro-lifer as a practicing Roman Catholic. Richard's situation leading a Scottish party is a bit different to mine leading a UK-wide party. But I'm planning to stand in Bedford, which is the #1 Labour marginal seat in the country, 147 votes over the Conservatives last time. And our new strategy is basically going to be that, to adopt a pro-family and children's rights stance, which to my mind cannot fail to get a few thousand and therefore impact on the result. I know Richard is of the view that there's quite a significant proportion of voters who will automatically vote for any pro-life candidate. Do you see that more widely being used in tactical voting to advance this?
Are you asking Richard or me?
Yeah, sorry, I was asking you, Anne. I'm sorry.
Yeah, yes. Now it is not unusual to have pro-life candidates in elections. And I would say this to you: general elections are very, very different from by-elections, because in general elections you're electing a government. And for example, in the last election, an awful lot of people were terrified of Corbyn. Therefore, the reaction you would get on the doorstep was, yes, I'm very much in sympathy with you. I'd like to vote for you. In my case, it was the Brexit Party. I'd like to vote for you, but I cannot risk Corbyn. and therefore in that circumstance that person votes Conservative, and of course it can work the other way. So in a general election, don't be too disappointed if you don't get a few thousand votes, but you should be able to get a few hundred, certainly, which is a start. Goes back to my point about starting and continuing. But in a by-election, that is a very different matter. And people are prepared then, because you're not going to change government. You're not going to have any influence. You're not going to bring in Corbyn. You're not going to bring in anybody. So by-elections, I always think, offer the much greater chance. Now, it's quite true, what Richard says, pro-life candidates will always get a certain number of votes. But it's only going to be in marginal seats where it's going to make an iota of difference, of course.
Right, but we're just expanding the window to make it more broadly pro-family. In fact, in much the same way that Richard's party does. So, for example, trying to sort out the absolute scourge of fatherlessness, trying to sort out, I mean, denying children access to both parents is nothing short of child abuse. It's also, it's abuse of the parent who doesn't get to see his child. It's a big driver of male suicide. And it's abuse of grandparents, among others. I mean, yes. I'm constantly contacted by grandmothers. It's rarely grandfathers for some reason, but grandmothers who don't see their beloved children, grandchildren, and are just beyond solace. It's tragic.
That is absolutely true. I wrote a book a long time ago in 2005 called Father Figure, the central character of which was a man whose ex-wife was trying to stop him seeing his own children without any grounds to do so. And I had a grandparent in the story, a grandmother in the story, or two grandmothers. And the number of people who wrote to me, and the grandmother was called Eileen, the number of people who wrote to me to say, I'm the Eileen of your story. And this was grandmothers whose sons had been deprived of access, and therefore, as a secondary factor, they too had been deprived of access. And this is women basically wanting to include children in the concept of the clean break. And of course, you never can. You can have a clean break on just about everything, but you cannot have it on children. And so, of course, the wider family is important. And of course, grandmothers are important. And there was a real effort some time ago to get grandparents' rights recognised in the family courts. There was a lot of lip service paid to it. But not much reality, and I think that is something else. I think what you need to find is a good pro-family MP who will put forward those sorts of bills.
Right, but I mean, why are even, I suppose, the vast majority of even Conservative MPs just, they're not vocal when it comes to family issues and access? I mean, it's really quite shocking how all parties have basically adopted a feminist position that if a that if a woman wants to deny her ex-partner access to the kids, the family courts will enable it, and politicians say nothing.
And that's important, because the politicians will always say, it's not they'll say nothing, but they'll always say the same thing. They'll always say it's a matter for the courts, always. And they'll always say the courts are obliged, as indeed in theory they are obliged to put the interests of the child first. That is the law. Therefore, it's a matter for the courts. That is how MPs are thinking. And as I say, Fathers for Justice were just starting to change that. And it's pretty crucial that you have that sort of long campaign, the long march, if you like, that you have that sort of campaign whereby it isn't just a series of initiatives. It's a very, very steady drip, drip, drip. Because what people were suddenly understanding was, from Fathers for Justice, they're not seeing their children despite a court order. I mean, I think a lot of people thought, the courts don't think they're fit fathers or something, but there is a court order and yet it's not being enforced. That's different. That's right. Very different.
But the judiciary, I've got to say, Anne, is utterly corrupt in this. I mean, something like, it's something like 2% of contact orders are enforced, where it's almost always the mother, frustrates them. And very often when a father goes to the court and points out that the contact orders not being respected, he will be given less access. So he has no incentive to actually try and do anything about it. It is utterly corrupt.
Yeah, it's quite true that, a lot of men are very unwilling to provoke their ex-partners or their ex-wives because they feel that if they do that, they're going to restrain access even more. And it's much easier with smaller children. But as soon as they start to get older, the mother says, oh, they don't want to see their dad, and suddenly the child's wishes are brought into it, which may be completely spurious. But I think you're right. I think the problem is access. Now, a lot of women would say to you that they can't get maintenance orders enforced. And they would be telling the truth. A lot do, but a lot can't. They would be telling the truth. And therefore, men are fully entitled to say, but we can't get our access orders enforced. And the whole family court system needs a thorough review, a very thorough review, looking at both men and women. Men should pay, and they should also be able to see their children. And unless on either side, the man or the woman, there is a good reason why access to the children should be forbidden, then it should always automatically take place. And if it doesn't, the frustrating partner must pay for it. I rather like the proposal which died a death, but there was one a few years ago which said that if a woman regularly refused access and was quite clearly doing it deliberately, if she regularly did that, then the courts would say when the access should take place, and while that access was taking place, the woman would have to be doing unpaid work. And in other words, she would be off the scene and not able to frustrate the access. That never came to anything. That never came to anything. But a man who, falls short of a child maintenance order, even if he's been maintaining the children quite regularly and circumstances suddenly cause him to fall short, he will be not only prosecuted, but persecuted by the CMS, persecuted by them. And it's a completely one-way street.
This is an issue that could be tackled in a completely gender-neutral way, couldn't it? If you're talking about the family courts not producing the right results, it's not exclusively a gender issue. As soon as something's seen as a men's issue, then it's seen as toxic because it's seen as anti-women. This could be addressed, I say, entirely gender-neutral. But such as the grip, I think that people of a certain persuasion have got on all the relevant institutions to it, that it just can't get a fair hearing. Just say another couple of things on this as well. For us in the Scottish Family Party, this is a really important issue, but the issue preceding it is promoting stable family life. We want to minimize the number of couples who find themselves in this situation. So promoting marriage, for example, is key. The other thing I would say, I've quite often been contacted with fathers who are being denied access to the children, and they're often utterly distraught. I mean, it's absolutely understandable, but they're in quite a state. And I would say in a lot of cases, they're in such a state that it's really hard to imagine them being effective campaigners for the cause, because they're so wound up, but they're so, in some cases, aggressive, a bit unrestrained in what they say, that it would be difficult to harness that in a positive direction. So I think that's a challenge in the future, to be able to take that frustration, but channel it in a palatable form into the political system. Which it seems like, Anne, you were saying that was what was happening to a significant degree in the past.
I don't know that I was saying that was what was happening, because that's what should happen. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think your view about family, and particularly supporting the family before the split.
With Fathers for Justice.
Fathers for Justice, they were starting to make some headway. They really were. Now, I think what's happened is that the men who were leading it have stopped because, their children are grown up and are now making their own choices, and there isn't very much anybody can do on either side. But at the time when they had children whom they wanted to see and couldn't see, they were very slowly. I mean, they did a lot of things I wouldn't advocate. They shinned up Buckingham Palace, for example, and they did all manner of things, but it got them in the news, and they then just kept on pressing their case. And I was quite surprised, because gradually there was some recognition that, maybe we haven't got something right here. But always, politicians will say to you, well, it's up to the courts. Well, it's up to the politicians to set parameters for the courts. We make the law, politicians make the law, the courts don't or shouldn't. The courts interpret the law.
I'd like to come on, Anne, to the to the position of who influences politicians and who influences civil servants, because it seems to us that and in fact, domestic violence is probably a good example of this. That let's say the Home Office is utterly corrupted by women's domestic violence organisations. They're even thanked, in the forewords of reports. And men's rights organisations, if they're listened to, I mean, they have zero impact. I mean, I engaged with a House of Commons Select Committee and presented some evidence that absolutely that they took no notice of. All they do is listen to certain people, and it seems that it's, feminists, although only 9% of British women are feminists, feminists absolutely control the advice that politicians get when civil servants or politicians appoint bodies. For example, the Family Justice Panel, 11 people, 10 women, 1 man, including a High Court judge, Stephen Cobb, I think his name is. Every one of them is a feminist. They only ever listen to feminist fantasies, lies, delusions, and myths.
Yes, you see, the sad thing is we've now redefined feminist. Because, as I said to you, in the 70s, I regarded myself as a feminist, which is, I didn't want a situation which we then had. It was perfectly lawful for an employer to be offered 2 rates of pay for exactly the same job. They'd advertise the graduate vacancy, and it was 1 lot of pay for men and 1 lot for women. And that was the sort of thing that I wanted gone. And so when people say to me, you're a feminist, I say I'm a 70s feminist. So I don't want to condemn all manifestations of feminism. But I think what we've got now is not actually feminism. It's something very, very different. It's quite militant misandry. It really is. And it's militant. And it is very silly. Regarding men as the root of all evil is very, very silly. Its long-term impact on society is going to be grievous.
Well, it has been grievous. I mean, for us, it's been grievous for 50 years, Anne. But I'll move on to a question from Douglas, who's speaking later in the conference, Douglas Wallace. He says, Anne, you mentioned that you appreciate the work of Erin Pizzey and asserted that feminism has been corrupted and no longer a positive force. But it was feminists who removed Erin from her position at the shelter and drove her out of the country. Wouldn't that mean that these bullying tactics have been in the movement since the inception, including the terrorism by these suffragettes?
I think there's no doubt at all that Erin Pizzey now finds herself up against the feminists on several levels, not least with the recent trans agenda. And she wants to protect women in refuges, and the trans people actually want men to come in saying that they're women, and that I just don't even begin to understand. So I think that it is quite true that modern feminism, what is now called feminism, which, as I say, is a million miles from when I was a feminist. Modern feminism is not even feminism. I mean, what is a feminist? A feminist stands up for women's rights, not for women's victimhood. She doesn't make victims out of women. She stands up for them as equals. And as I say, I've got very difficult problems with today's definition of feminism, which is effectively whinging and whining. I'm wanting favours for the men. I don't want any favours from you. Sorry, Mike.
But Anne, I respect that your position, but I go back to the point that victimhood is the road to power. I mean, feminism for us has been the seeking of female supremacy since the 1850s at the very least. In fact, I mean, the reality, I know there are some areas, Anne, and you've cited them, where women didn't have rights and things look quite curious through a modern eye. But the reality is that women have been a privileged class since the dawn of time, as far as we can understand it.
Right. Well, I'm not going to go with that, and you wouldn't expect me to go with that. You've only got to think that we actually needed to have a Married Women's Property Act because all a woman's property was considered to belong to her husband. You've only got to consider that we didn't have the vote for goodness knows how long. You've only got to consider that we didn't get equal pay for an exactly equal job, and I'm not talking about the modern equivalents. You've only got to look at those things, that you could turn a woman down for finance without her husband's signature on the form, that you could refuse a woman accommodation, and that actually happened to me on the grounds that I was a woman. And you could certainly refuse mortgages and other things. And you could do that, and you could quite openly say, because you're a woman. I remember when I was applying for a couple of jobs after I left Oxford, a couple of companies actually said to me in terms of, we don't take women. And so I do not believe that we have been the suppressing sex. And I think it's unhelpful to talk about the sexes in that sense. I want equality between the sexes. In the past, there have been, I think, huge injustices towards women. There are now huge injustices towards men. That is not something I want to see. And instead of going back for 150 years to find agreements, actually stick with the current time and what people can do. And as I say, every single person watching this should be making an appointment to see their member of parliament, and not go with a vast agenda that covers everything, but go with a few specific points, and just try to get the case over. Because an MP will come in, he'll say, oh, I had such a funny person in my surgery on Saturday, he actually believes in men's rights. And another MP will say, oh, actually, so did I. And that is when people stop to consider. And when Fathers for Justice were going into surgeries, that had an impact.
Well, I don't think we see anything in the courts today that show any of that influence. But, talking about single issues, one that comes to mind. Well, sorry, first of all, I think I should mention this. It'd be remiss of me not to show you that book. A snappy 675 pages long. So William Collins's book, The Empathy Gap, and he also runs a blog called The Illustrated Empathy Gap. And it's very good on a lot of the history. I've lost my train of thought now. That's what happens when you get into your 60s, isn't it?
You try your 70s. Yeah.
I know he is very hot on the history of feminism. So, for example, this thing about a man owning the property, I think you said, when they're a couple. There are always flip sides to these coins, Anne. So to my mind, one of the flip sides to that particular coin was that in the Victorian era, at least, when a woman incurred a debt and couldn't pay it, guess who went to prison?
But it was also perfectly possible, as you must know, because it regularly happened, for the man to put an announcement in the paper which said, regrettably, Mr. Smith can no longer be responsible for Mrs. Smith's debts. And that was actually something that even into the 1950s, you would see quite a lot in newspapers. So there was a way he could ditch that. But yes, I mean, if he controlled all her property and all her money, I suppose it was perfectly reasonable also to expect him, therefore, to take responsibility for the debts. So it was not unreasonable. But where are we getting with this? I am not interested. Well, I am interested, but only in a general sense. In the last 150 years, I'm interested in the here and now. That's what I'm interested in. You can't get access. You're called the perpetrator if an allegation is made against you right from the start. You may not apply for a constituency, even if you've grown up there, if it's an all-woman shortlist. You have here and now issues. Never mind the Married Woman's Property Act. You have here and now issues. So stop arguing about the past and concentrate now. And what are you guys doing about it? I go back to the challenge I threw out at the end of my interview. What are you guys doing about it?
Okay, well, let me take up a single issue, which is a pretty big one in the men's rights movement, Anne, and it relates to something. It relates to genital mutilation. Genital mutilation of either boys or girls has been a crime since the 1861 Offences Against a Person Act, because it's the infliction of bodily harm without informed consent. Now, I'm sorry. I was saying that genital mutilation, non-therapeutic genital, has been a crime since at least the 1861 Offences Against a Person Act, and it was a crime, against boys and girls. And in 1985, there was the introduction of, I think, the first female, they call it the Female Genital Mutilation Act, and there's been just an untold amount of resource gone into trying to end FGM, and quite rightly. In the meantime, MGM has had the only mention in Hansard that I'm aware of is that of Philip Davis in an International Men's Day debate, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, in which he pointed out all this. You know, it would take a parliamentary override for genital mutilation to be, you know, to be permissible. So here's something that it is 100% black and white, that male circumcision, non-therapeutic male circumcision, MGM, is a crime. And we have one politician out of 650 that mentions it. The media says nothing about it. So even when we focus on one issue, Anne, even when we focus on one issue, nothing happens.
I think you'll find that the reason that there was an enormous focus on female genital mutilation was because most people didn't know it existed. This is a practice in third world countries. I'm not saying it doesn't happen here, it does, but it's, you know, it was particular practice amongst certain communities, and most people were completely innocent about it. Now, we all know about circumcision because we all read the Bible. So, you know, we know that, well, we all used to read the Bible, but so we know that happens. I really think that when there was suddenly a discussion about female genital mutilation, MPs were, and I was there at the time, MPs were sort of scratching their heads and saying, you know, what is this? Why don't we know about this? Why haven't we been talking about this? So I really think that was why the emphasis suddenly came about, you know, and I would say again, and I'm aware that you won't agree with me, but I would say again, please be very, very selective about what you take to MPs. And take to MPs the things that they are most likely to be sympathetic about, and that has to be access to children and inequality before the law in allegations of sexual abuse, where they're just the perpetrator from the start. And I think that if you do that, if you talk to MPs about what is already in the backs of their minds, that they're actually very slow about dragging it to the front, you will have a greater impact. I'm not dismissing what you say about male mutilation, but you do have an awful lot of problems. We've got religion tied up in this and everything else. And I just think be selective about what you campaign for.
I think the danger with
sorry, Richard. Sorry, I just want to finish one point. There are no exemptions allowed to the law of the land for religious or cultural considerations, Anne. So the question then is why, you know, given that non-therapeutic, MGM is a crime, why are politicians not, you know, why is that the differential? I accept your point, Anne, about awareness, and I think there probably was poor awareness, but everyone knows about MGM, but the things they do something about FGM and do literally nothing about MGM. In fact, the government even takes taxes off the butchers, the criminal butchers who are carrying this out, while they spend untold millions trying to stamp out the probably tiny number of FGM. Why that gender differential, Anne? That's what I'm asking.
Well, as I said, I think the huge emphasis on female was because it was, I won't say it was a new concept, but it was a pretty new concept. It was something that hadn't really hit people's consciousness. And as far as a male mutilation goes, you do have to accept that this has been a practice of a very major religion for a very, very long time.
And so has FGM,
yeah.
Anne.
Yeah, I accept that, but some of the things that happened with FGM are pretty horrible. And no, I'm going to say it because I know that you want every last issue to be rehearsed, and I'm saying be selective, because some issues are more likely to succeed than others, and once you've got there on one issue, you can then raise others, and that's all I'm saying. And you can reject my advice, but I was there for 23 years, and I do know how the place works. And Richard does as well.
Sorry, Richard.
Can I jump in? I'm going to jump in. I'm jumping in.
Go on, Richard.
I think using the word butcher is I think that's a bit over the top.
Call it what you like.
Yeah, I don't think it's helpful. I think in terms of these male and female procedures. I think it's got to be a balance of looking at what effect they actually have. Now, I haven't looked at it in great detail, but if there's a case that male circumcision actually medically has negligible effects, then it is possible for someone to present a case that could validly come into the realm of parental choice. But I think the danger with this issue, I think the danger with this issue,
Richard, I'm sorry, but
I think the danger with this issue, the men's rights movement, is it appears like the men's rights movement is just like trying to be a mirror image of feminism.
It is always extremely damaging, Richard. There's probably 80 or 100 pages on male genital mutilation in this book. It is extremely damaging always. The idea that it's some trivial little thing compared to FGM is an absolute myth. It's a lie. And I'm sorry that you bought the effects. What are the effects? Mm-hmm. Well, right up to death, and even people who've carried out circumcision, which have led to the death of baby boys, have not been punished.
Well, first of all, I need a lot of convincing that is a common effect. I will accept always.
I'm not saying it's common, Anne, but
yeah, exactly. It's very rare.
Of course it is, Anne, but 90% of the nerve cells,
properly, and it probably wasn't done properly, and there is a difference.
And I don't want to fixate on the small number of deaths, but what I'm saying is that all MGM is more damaging than most FGM. That is simply biology. And again, I go back to William Collins. This takes a bit of reading and understanding. But people don't do that because there is this empathy gap. They just don't care.
Well, I was reading a paper just the other day, an academic paper, which I haven't exactly made my mind up about, but it was presenting the case that the evidence for the effects of male circumcision are so slight, might even be positive in some ways as well, that it's something that ought to come into the realm of parental choice. I say I'm not sure I entirely agree with him, but I think that nonsense. I think there can be a case. But what do you think about? I think of it as a danger of starting to look like the mirror image of feminism.
Yeah.
Oh, Richard. Yeah. What we're talking here is gender equality. If it's not okay to butcher the genitals of girls, it's not okay to butcher the genitals of boys. It's really that bloody simple.
I know. I think the argument that Richard is putting forward is that if it is done properly, as it has been for millennia, it is not actually butchery.
Would we say that?
Are very mild.
And would we say that about FGM? Because that's gone on for thousands of years, as long as it's done nicely.
But it isn't ever done nicely. It's actually a rather.
And nor is circumcision, Anne. 90% of the nerve cells. I'm sorry, Anne, but you are simply wrong in this area, and you are, Richard, as well, frankly.
Mike, I can tell you one thing that we're both right about. This will not get you much sympathy. Please concentrate on those areas which will.
And we're still looking for one, Anne, because we find every single one of them, politicians don't give a damn about men's rights.
Yes, but you have to, as I've already said, it's a drip approach. You have to keep going. And access, equality before the law in terms of being called perpetrator or victim, positive discrimination, which can actually deny you a job, those things will get sympathy. You go in there talking about circumcision, and I have to tell you, and I'm telling you this as a former politician, you will get no darn sympathy at all. I'm only being honest.
Okay, let's come on. No, I appreciate your honesty. We all appreciate your honesty, Anne. But I'm afraid that when it comes to the damage wrought by genital mutilation, anyway, let's move on from that. So Steve Moxon says, and you need also to read up on the history of women and rights. The law regarding divorce, marriage, property was so as to force men invariably to support their families, irrespective of circumstances. Women always had the vote, re their interests in the local manor and church courts, whereas men had no say at all regarding their interests, such as being drafted for war and taxes to pay for them.
Right. Of course, men were responsible for earning for their families. The social construct at the time was marriage, which was a long-term legal commitment. And the normal construct was that the woman brought up the children because, after all, she gave birth to them and she breastfed them. She looked after the children. The men went out and brought home the bacon. That was the social construct. And as far as I'm concerned, that was how society was at that time. And I'm going to say something now which is going to shock you. Actually, most of the really happy, stable families I know still have that arrangement. I know it's heresy today, but it is true. And I uphold that arrangement and I applaud it. And were I married, which I am not, I would expect to be looking after the kids, and I would expect the man to go out and bring home the lolly. Sorry, guys, that's what I would expect. Of course, you're not obliged to marry me if you wouldn't accept that was the division. But that was the social construct at the time, and as I say, I wish it were more prevalent now.
I think what we want now is a society where men and women and couples can make their decisions to live the way they like. I believe a lot of what you were saying there, I believe a lot of that is to some degree hardwired into human nature. It is generally what men and women tend to prefer if left to their own devices. But we've had decades of governments who've made it their mission to push men and women, to push families down a different path.
Oh, yeah, I know. And actually, if you want a persecuted minority, don't look to the men, look to those mothers who choose to stay at home, because the tax system and everything is weighted against them.
Absolutely.
Okay, Mike, maybe you ought to climb onto some other ground.
Sorry, Anne, climb onto what?
Some other ground.
Some other brand.
No, ground.
Ground. No, that's okay. No, these are important issues, and they actually, Anne, it's very interesting because they exemplify the gap. I mean, a number of things we talked about, domestic violence and genital mutilation, they sort of exemplify that the gap between even really bright people like yourself and the reality can be so enormous, and it's difficult to account for it other than the empathy gap, the wish to. I'm sorry, Anne, but it affects everything.
Telling me I've got no empathy towards men.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that, but Anne, I'm saying
one of your loudest voices,
yeah. And I'm saying like most people, your empathy for men and boys is less than for women, and Richard has just demonstrated his if you like, lack of concern in the area, which it's something that the men's rights movement has been talking about for 40 years.
No, that's really unfair. But what I was saying, are you talking about circumcision still?
Yeah.
Okay, what I was saying is you need to look at the specifics of the risks involved or whatever, and then make a decision on the basis of those facts. And the facts will be different for male and female versions of circumcision. But make a decision on the basis of those facts whether or not it should come under the remit of parental choice. So I think that decision, it's not a men's rights or a women's rights issue. That's just something to weigh up in each of those two separate circumstances.
Richard, I'm sorry, but you have a copy of this book now, so you have what you need to be informed about male genital mutilation. And trust me, it is an appalling thing. The fact it's gone on for thousands of years doesn't make it any more right than female genital mutilation. But I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there. And thank you so much for your time and for your patience with my occasional passion on these issues. Yes, I'm sorry we have to wrap it up there, but thank you so much for the interview, and thank you so much for this live and Q&A. We are huge admirers of what you do, and I look forward to posting this interview up.
Well done. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, bye.